and good afternoon. Welcome to the Pepperdine School of Public Policy. I'm Pete Peterson, the very grateful dean of this graduate policy school, coming to you live from the Dean's Conference Room here on our Malibu campus, welcoming you here to our next Politics and Pandemic webinar series session. Today, we are delighted to welcome Rick Cole, former city manager and my friend at the City of Santa Monica, who will be leading today's session, The Pandemic Hits Home, COVID-19, Local Government, and the Four Horsemen of the Fiscal Apocalypse. The usual format, if this is your first time joining us for one of these webinars, is that our main guest speaker will begin with about 15 or 20 minutes of remarks. Then for the balance of an hour, I'll be moderating a conversation with you all. Due to the size of our audience here, all questions should be sent in via the chat feature on the Zoom platform. If you've never used Zoom before, the chat icon is should be at the center bottom of your screen. Simply click on that, type in your question, and I'll be getting to as many of those as I can in this 1 hour session. This again is one of a series of webinars on the subject of politics and the pandemic. Recently, we had a discussion on the impact of the pandemic on the 2020 election last week with Dan Schnur. And of course, today we are looking specifically at the impact of the pandemic on local government with Rick Cole. For the few of you who don't know Rick, Rick has spent 3 decades in public service. Most recently, he served 5 years as city manager of my hometown of Santa Monica. In that role, he helped steer the downtown community plan to unanimous adoption by the city council, and negotiated a historic consent decree with the FAA to allow the city to close the Santa Monica airport. Rick has been recognized as one of America's top public officials of the year by Governing magazine, and was one of the top 25 doers, dreamers, and drivers by GovTech magazine. He's won a number of awards for municipal management excellence. Prior to coming to the city of Santa Monica, Rick served as deputy mayor for budget and innovation for the city of LA, where he oversaw 5 city departments. And prior to that, Rick served for 15 years as city manager of 2 iconic Southern California cities, Ventura, which is where I first got to know Rick, and the city of Azusa. We have a very terrific registration and sign up here for this talk. And again, we will begin with Rick's remarks and then engage with you all in a conversation about such an important subject as the impact of the pandemic on local government finances. And so without any further ado, I will turn it over to our main guest speaker, Rick Cole. Rick.
Good afternoon, everyone. And I'm delighted, as Pete is, that we have so many folks from local government, from the civic sector, from the nonprofit world, from the business world, and the academic world for this dialogue. I'm not sure I'll talk for 15 or 20 minutes, but we'll see. I wanted to lay a groundwork, a common framework for what we'll be discussing today, which is a challenge for all of us, not just local government, to the extent that we're a democracy. We're all in this together, not just from the standpoint of a nice, tidy hashtag or slogan, but from a reality that here in the 5th largest economy in the world, our quality of life and our standard of living are dependent upon local government being able to deliver outcomes in this time of crisis. Years ago, I learned from someone wiser than me the value of taking the long view and the high road. I think that we're now living in a time when literally, I think we all feel a little out of control, living almost moment to moment, day by day. Wondering how long this is going to go along, how it's going to affect us, our children, our friends, our parents, our communities. So I'm going to try to take um, into account the reality of that loss of control that we all feel today, but also take the long view and encourage us all to take the high road. So the title of this talk refers to a recent column I wrote for the planning report called The Four Horsemen of the Fiscal Apocalypse. We all know that iconography from the Christian faith, from the book of Revelation. It's a part of our common cultural legacy. And the four horsemen, of course, are frightening: war, famine, disease. From the standpoint of local government, though, I would describe the four horsemen as first, cratering revenues. We'll talk about that. Second, neglected infrastructure. Third, pension debt. And finally, I think the thing we'll most need to work together on, and that's changing community needs. So let's start with cratering revenue. The Congressional Budget Office just came out with the newest numbers that the national government will run an unprecedented $3.7 trillion deficit this year. Just unimaginable numbers a couple of months ago. And that's before the $3 trillion additional relief that the Democrats are advocating for and have actually passed in the House. At the state level, the governors may revise, identified a $54 billion shortfall in the next fiscal year. And the California League of Cities has estimated, based upon very careful analysis done by Michael Coleman and others, who's an expert in that field, that the revenue shortfall for the coming year for local governments, for specifically the 482 California cities, will be $7 billion. Now, trillions and billions and even millions are difficult for folks to get their arms around. What does that mean? But it means just staggering impacts on the ability of government to simply maintain what it was doing before the crisis, let alone deal with the crisis and deal with the pain and the changing needs in our community. It's just a startling drop off the cliff, not unlike what we've seen in unemployment numbers, and not unconnected to those two things. The economy is shut down. It is opening back up, but in very modest ways, and in ways that I think are not going to be at all like things were before. Even if tomorrow the governor, the president, the mayor of Los Angeles were to say, let's throw the doors open, everybody go back to normal, an enormous number of people would be skittish about doing just that, would stay away from travel, would stay away from sporting events, concerts, even local dining and shopping. And frankly, even if the economy opens back up, you have 40 million unemployed people who are going to be very skittish about spending money, even if they have it, because they'll be drawing down on their savings. And people who are still employed or who are retired are also going to be skittish about spending money. So there's going to be this triple whammy. The first is so much is closed. The second is even if it reopens, people are going to be skittish for health reasons, venturing out into the world. And then finally, the economic impact has been so staggering that the very basis for city revenues is under assault. And it's important to keep in mind, again, taking the long view, that the way we pay for local government, the 482 cities that range from Los Angeles, 4 million people, down to Vernon, which is literally next door, 125 population, that range of cities, the way we pay the bills, the bread and butter services that Californians rely upon in their local neighborhoods and communities, the police, the fire, the public works, the streets, the parks, regulating land use, enforcing health and safety codes. The basis for paying for that, the system, you can't even call it a system. It is a patchwork that has grown up in the 42 years since the passage of Prop 13. Before Prop 13, things were fairly simple. Not necessarily equitable, but they were simple. property taxes paid for the vast majority of services in the vast majority of cities. Sales tax was important. In some communities, hotel tax was important, but the backbone of supporting and paying the bills was property tax, a pretty stable, pretty predictable form of revenue. That was slashed by 40% in the wake, or 57% in the wake of Proposition 13. There was a temporary patch. There was emergency legislation passed in a couple of weeks because it passed on the first Tuesday in June, and budgets came into effect the 1st of July, the beginning of the fiscal year. So ABA came out of an emergency effort by the governor and legislature to adjust to Prop 13. That emergency legislation is still in effect today. It's slightly tweaked about a year later, but basically we're operating 482 cities in the 5th largest economy in the world, serving the vast majority of the 40 million people who live here with vital services that they rely on every single day on a patchwork emergency legislation of what cities have been able to opportunistically seize upon for the last 42 years. And now that house of cards has collapsed. So that's cratering revenue. What about neglected infrastructure? That's the silent crisis here. In the buffeting since 1978, the early 90s, the early 2000s, 2008, we had a series of very sharp recessions here in California. The first was an outgrowth of the end of the Cold War, where aerospace and other stalwarts of our economy cratered. Then we went up with the dot-com boom, and then we went down with the dot-com boom because California relies so heavily on the state income tax. And then, of course, impact to state, county, and local government finances. So here's the challenge. To react to that, governments have emphasized services which are very visible and highly valued at the expense of investing in their infrastructure. Now, that's not true of all cities, but it's true of the vast majority of cities, particularly economically strapped cities. So they just stopped fixing the streets. They stopped doing preventive maintenance. They stopped expanding, even as they grew some of the basic systems like water treatment plants. And this is a silent crisis because it creeps up month after month, year after year. It doesn't happen all at once, and until there's a giant sinkhole in Sunset Boulevard, people don't notice that you haven't been repairing your water mains. Until the streets collapse, people say, "Oh, a lot of potholes," but that it moves slowly, and the result is it's caught up to us. We've had 30 years of disinvestment in our basic infrastructure, and the longer you wait, the more expensive it is. You can pay now, or you can pay a lot more later. The third of the horsemen that threaten local government is pension debt. And I think people, again, it's a slow moving crisis. People know that it's a huge time bomb. The governor and the legislature did a patch in 2012, significant reforms, but it only applied to folks hired since 2012. And there's a tremendous number of legacy folks still in the system who are racking up unsustainable obligations that simply are not realistically going to be able to be paid for under the way we do things now. So we're either going to have to, this was before the crisis, cities were either going to have to cut services or raise taxes. And a number of them were raising taxes just in the March election here in California. And that was, seems like a lifetime ago, but it was only 2 months ago. In the March elections, 88 cities in Los Angeles County, over a quarter of them had sales tax measures on the ballot, right? So 1/4 of the cities in one election, and a number of them passed. One of them in Long Beach passed by 16 votes out of 100,000 cast. So paying for pension debt is a huge challenge. Was before the crisis. Now, depending on what happens with the markets, and they go up and down every day, but if they do not recover, CalPERS is going to have even worse challenges, and there's nowhere to turn except back to the cities, because the obligations have been entered into. They have to be paid, and the only way to do that will be to either again slash services or cut revenues or raise revenues at a time when no one wants to pay higher taxes, may not be able to pay higher taxes, and at a time when we're already going to have to cut services that in some cities are cut to the bone. Here's the last of the four horsemen, and then I want to talk just a moment about the challenge that we all face and what we do about these four threats. The last of them is changing community needs. The early part of March, we kind of had an understanding of what community needs were. We have crime, so we have police departments. We have healthcare emergency needs, so we have fire departments. We want parks. We want the basic services that Californians rely upon. Challenge to pay for it. Challenge to deliver high quality results. Some significant problems that were overwhelming our system, the most important of which was homelessness. The governor devoted his entire State of the State address to the challenge of homelessness, which is out of control in our major metropolitan areas because of the underlying affordable housing crisis and the underlying challenge of even if you work for a living, even if you get the minimum wage has been raised, you can't afford to go out and get a new apartment or a new home. It's only if you are already in one and are protected by rent control or by your mortgage that the vast majority of working people in California could afford housing. Tremendous stresses already, and now the pandemic has made all of those worse. And we have new needs. We have people who they can't be evicted because of the eviction moratorium, but they're racking up rent payments that are going to have to be paid. And if they're not paid, then what does that do to the underlying property values on which local governments depend? You have people out of work, you have small businesses closing, you have this tremendous wave of stress that is continuing to roll through the economy with no end in sight. So community needs are different. People are going to look to their local government. They're probably not going to look to Washington for solutions. They're going to look to their local city hall. And that puts an enormous amount of stress on local politics. And here's the truth, friends. Many of you have served in local government that we're speaking to today. The communities take us for granted. Yes, there are activists who obsessively follow local government and involved in the politics, and the keyboard warriors that on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook are second guessing us all the time. But the challenge is that the vast majority of people have no clue how their government works. They don't understand municipal finance, which has become incredibly complicated as a result of cities trying to get around the challenges posed by Prop 13 over the last 42 years. And they've been able to take local government for granted and to basically treat it as a vending machine. I pay my taxes, and government should take care of these problems, right? They should educate our kids, the school systems. They should keep our streets safe. They should respond when we call 911 for a medical emergency or any issue. They should take care of our children after school. They should do all these things, and somebody should figure all that out because I pay my taxes, and I think it's going to mean, again, we're all in this together. It's going to mean a rekindling, not just of local democracy, not just people arguing about how we pay the bills and how we balance the budget and what services get cut and who suffers and gains in all of that. But I think much more importantly, there's going to be a need for people to step up through their neighborhood associations, through their businesses, through their civic groups, through new forms of organization that don't exist today, through their faith communities, and step up and meet some of these community needs, because government is not going to have the money, nor is government necessarily the solution to some of these pressing problems. We're going to have to go back and draw upon American history, the legacy of the Depression, the legacy of the days before the New Deal, in which we help each other and we look out for each other and we work together on common problems. In the absence of that, I fear really toxic, dysfunctional politics and a lot of good leaders getting really chewed up in that toxic atmosphere. I'm an optimist. The Pope says there's never a cause for optimism because things don't always work out. But Pope Francis says there's always a cause for hope. So maybe I'm not so much an optimist as I'm hopeful. But it's people like you that are on this call that are paying attention, that are looking for answers, that are ready to roll up your sleeves. We're going to have to work on this together. And I'll just finish with this, because I had an interesting conversation today with someone who's in the homeless services world. And they've made a conscious choice not to call the people they work with clients, but participants. Because they view getting out of homelessness as not something that the government or a social worker gives to you. It's a process in which they're along the journey with you back to self-sufficiency and having a roof over your head. And I think in the same way, we are not going to be able to be passive citizens who give our input and tell the city council or the governor, do this, don't do that, tax him, not me. Make those decisive decisions that I want you to do. Shut everything down so people will stay healthy, or open everything up so the economy will come back. We're going to have to move from that model of input and opinions to actual participation. People are going to have to get involved in rebuilding a sound fiscal structure for local government. They're going to have to get involved in figuring out different ways of meeting community needs. They're going to have to figure out new ways of meeting new community needs. And that's not something that government can just do automatically. And if it doesn't, then we throw the bastards out and we put new bastards in. It's going to have to be a much more collaborative, much more inclusive, much more equitable, common effort. And that's what self-government is. Americans 200 and some years ago came up with this idea that we can actually govern ourselves. We don't need kings, we don't need priests, we don't need aristocrats, we can govern ourselves. Well, we're going to have to do that now. And that's not just voting, that's actually participating in rebuilding the services that we need as a community. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Pete.
Thanks so much, Rick. A great way to set the table for what is already becoming a very vibrant chat room. And I will be filtering in some of those questions from there. I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative and just kick off with a question that is in some ways aligned with some of the questions that are coming in on the chat feature, and use as a point of departure your last Horsemen, if you will, about the changing community needs in public service. One of the terms that we use here at the Graduate Policy School is cross-sector leadership, this understanding that to solve many of our biggest challenges demands not only the public sector, but also the private sector and the nonprofit sector working together in some new ways, sometimes moderated by technology, sometimes not. I saw in one of your recent interviews for the planning report that you noted that it has often been the case that when revenues are flush, if you will, that when a particular policy issue arises like homelessness, the next logical step is to create a department for that. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you envision this new relationship, if you will, albeit mandated by current conditions, in which government is going to have to work, especially at the local level, more closely with the private sector and the nonprofit sector to deliver what I think we can all agree are essential services, but they'll have to be delivered in different ways?
So let me try to concisely answer that in three quick ways. One is a narrative, right? Because it's different from the narrative of we got a problem, so let's set up a government agency to deal with that problem and give it funding and send it off and check back with an audit in a couple of years and then scream and yell that it didn't do what it was supposed to do as quickly as we hoped. And that's a narrative that I learned from reading storybooks to my kids. The Legend of the Stone Soup, where the refugee from the war, the soldier, arrives in a village and everyone's terrified and they've hidden all the food because they think he's going to pillage the village. And then the children come out because he's set up a big cauldron that he found, and he's lit a fire under it and he put a stone in it. And well, what's going on? And he explains it's stone soup and it's going to be delicious. And put the stone in. Well, stone soup, what's that? So he said, well, it just needs a little bit of salt. And so one kid said, oh, we got salt in our house. It runs back and puts the salt in, and then yeah, but it needs a cabbage. And you can see where this is going. Mm-hmm. Everyone sort of tentatively and then with greater enthusiasm and gusto puts in their piece. You talk about cross-sectoral leadership. That's easy to say. But when I talk to private sector people about the government, their heads want to explode. The bureaucracy, the patience, all the people that they have to answer to, how long it takes. And you talk to folks in government about people in the private sector, they're completely unrealistic. They pound the table. They expect things to happen overnight, blah, blah, blah. Then you add in people in the faith community, the nonprofit community, the academic community. We have to learn how to do that. So the second thing is there's a book about this. I'm not that smart that I have all the answers, nor could I squeeze them into 90 seconds. But Stephen Goldsmith, who's at the Harvard Kennedy School, but who has real world experience as the former mayor of Indianapolis, as the former deputy mayor of New York, called Governing by Network, right? Which is a different model from government is governing or governance. Which is the idea that we're working together and everybody brings their best, right? In that stone soup, the private sector brings some key skills. They're better at measuring outcomes. They're better at managing performance. They're further along in understanding the role of talent and motivation in moving organizations forward. But they don't have all the answers. And you don't want to just hand it over to the private sector to do a lot of things that they're ill-equipped to do. Similarly, there's some things that government needs to do. They need to be the arbiter. They need to be held accountable. They need to be the organizer. They need to be equitable and transparent. But you need the faith community. You need the academic world. You need the nonprofit sector and the civic sector to play their roles. I'm going to all those things. And the third thing is, well, so, okay, that's all great theory. What does that look like? And the experience that I had a long time ago really taught me that this is not theory, this is actually reality. There was a frightening incident when I was on the city council in Pasadena. A nanny and a little child were held up at gunpoint in a public park where lots of people in the neighborhood should have known, but didn't. And no one was hurt, but just frightened everyone. Mm-hmm. And in the middle of this park, which is part of the reason why this happened, was an abandoned building that before the prior recession had a fire, and then they ran out of money to tear it down, so they just fenced it off, right? So you couldn't see from one side of the park to the other side of the park, and that's how this incident happened. So the neighbors irate, let's tear this thing down. We've been waiting for years, and suddenly it's a big crisis. So I go to the city manager and I say, well, we need to tear this down. And because I was chair of the finance committee, we got it right into the capital improvement project. And, a year and a half later, it would have been torn down because we got the funding and go through the RFP and letting the contract. The neighbor's like, what? A year and a half from now? You think this is a good idea? You think you've done something for us? We want it done now. So one of the people said, how about we do it? Let's the neighborhood tear the thing down. But, 17 lawyers will tell you 17 reasons why that can't happen. But I managed to persuade the city manager to lend us a public works truck and a young guy who worked part-time on the weekends, and a bunch of gloves and a bunch of saws and a bunch of hammers, and we tore the thing down. So it's the equivalent not of a barn raising where the
Mm-hmm.
community all comes together, but a
Mm.
barn, de-raising. And
Mm.
I think that's the model.
Yeah.
We need to have everybody pitching in, the private sector bringing what it does best, the public sector bringing what it needs to do, these other sectors contributing in important and key ways. And then we have to learn how to work that together. So we're not driving all each other crazy. We need to learn how to work. And that's where this cross-sectoral leadership comes into play.
Margie had a good question. At local government level, when we're talking about democracy, we're talking about staff and council. And we need not dwell too much on your recent experience, but it's fair to say that council and staff may be seeing this crisis in different ways. There are different impacts on both staff and council regarding the decisions. One political, and quite frankly, for many staff, very personal. These are full-time jobs, right? And so I wondered if you could talk about how, understanding that we're going to have a series of what might be called difficult conversations between between staff, that's a Freudian slip, between staff and council. And I know we have many council members as well as staff in various cities on this webinar.
Mm-hmm.
How do we begin to have these very difficult conversations that are going to impact council and staff, frankly, in different ways?
Well, I think we're going to have to give up something that is dear to all of us, which is control. Mm. And the public wants to we elected you, so we control you. The electeds feel like we're elected, so we're in charge. And the staff feel, well, that's all well and good, but we're the ones who actually do the job day to day, and we are the ones who are have the most expertise and frankly at stake in all of this. So I think this is always the difficulty, is the illusion of power and the expectation of power. The expectation is, well, you will do your job. You will do your job the way I want you to do it, but you will do your job. Americans yearn for decisive leadership, and when they get it, they are not always happy with it, and sometimes are happy with it for a little while and then grow quickly tired of it. So we're going to have to give up control. What does that look like? Again, I crashed into this in Santa Monica, and with all humility, still feeling like an asteroid hit us, and we all did our best. But we're going to have adaptive leadership, which means those difficult conversations, right? The idea that we can not have those difficult conversations because they're difficult and they take time. So let's just act. That will work in the short run, but will inflict long-term irreparable damage on the body politic. Again, we're all in this together, and the idea that the electeds can simply, by fiat, decide this is what we're going to do, and pull the trigger, and feel like, well, it was a hard choice, but we did what we're supposed to do. That's a narrative that I think has limited shelf life, because the staff, spent 37 years in the public sector. Staff people have a lot more talent, a lot more heart, and a lot more skill than ever gets utilized, and frankly ever gets recognized. And you get, when you don't lead people, but you order people around, you get what a friend of mine used to call malicious compliance, right? Okay, boss, we'll do that, sure. We'll cut the government by 40%. Yeah, okay, fine. And then you see how well it works. Good luck with that, right? Because it's not, well, we didn't have anything to do with that. You decided that. You're the boss. And we reserve the right to criticize you. We reserve the right to sue you. We reserve the right to hate you. But it's your problem. So, you decide to do that. Good luck. And, that's not what everybody decides. I mean, many people will, including I'm sure some of the people whose names I recognize on this call, they will wade through acres of excrement to do a good job,
Yeah.
no matter what their bosses do or fail to do. But there does need to be a dialogue and a partnership, not just with staff and council, but with the third leg of that, which is the community, right? Which is even more complicated. But cutting through the absence of, to just have a public hearing, where no one listens, that is not going to, in order to lay the foundation for a long haul, because this crisis is not going to be over in 3 months, and the impacts of it are not going to be over in 3 months. We need to be having serious, hard, public discussions that involve people in having to not just say, "Oh, cut all the government," or "Oh, save all my programs." That's a fine emotional response, but we're going to have to get past that emotional response and get to actual partnership between those three things: the professional staff who are tasked with doing the job every single day, the electeds who are in the middle between them, and the community who have high expectations. And to make this all work, to make Santa Monica city government work with 40% less money, that is a difficult conversation. To make a city that maybe isn't going to lose 40% of their budget, but they're already down to the nubs, and now have to take a 20% cut, when they have no programs that aren't critical. That's going to take some really difficult conversations, and this is not a great time for Americans to have that, because we want to do it in 140 characters. But it takes, and it's important at some level to be face to face, and that's a problem right now. But we're going to have those conversations. Otherwise, local government is in for a world of hurt, and I mean a world of hurt. Nothing like any of us have experienced in our lifetime.
Rick, we've gotten several questions here. It's a perfect segue into another set of questions. Susan Clark, I see, our friend in common, Sandy Smith, several others are asking about this public engagement aspect. Obviously, that is a major priority here at the Graduate Policy School. We have our Davenport Institute that does a lot of training of local government officials and how to hold better public meetings. The use of technology, as we're doing right now, to facilitate at least some degree of public engagement.
And right now, only two of us talking, right? So that's not ideal. Not ideal.
Well, and that's, I guess, it leads to these other questions that we're having around public engagement, and what is the role of the public, not only in the delivery of services, but in the setting of priorities for what services the government is going to deliver, even at the local level, versus others. And I wonder if a way of opening that conversation with the public is to say that we agree that all these services are important. Because I think sometimes the way we get in local government is to say, well, that's a waste of money over there. Chances are there's a constituency that vitally needs that service. So I'm wondering if a way of framing the conversation is to say, we're going to be 40% smaller, but we all agree that the services, the 100% of services that we've offered are important. Now let's have a conversation about how we're going to do that.
Yeah, I agree with you, Pete, although here's something that I fundamentally disagree with, and it makes me an iconoclast in local government, and that is, I think we use the wrong word of services. I don't think we're in the services business. I think we're in the outcomes business, right? We don't exist to have a police department and a fire department. We exist because we have crime, and we used to have a lot of fires, and now we have a lot of medical emergencies. We think we're in the service business. And all these services were invented at a particular time for a particular reason to solve in a particular place. I think what we need, what we need is outcomes. And sometimes we are wedded to particular ways of delivering those outcomes that we call services. And we say, well, those are necessary. Well, the problem is real, although sometimes those problems have changed, right? We no longer have an epidemic of fires in our cities. We used to, which is why we have fire departments and red trucks and fire stations and poles, and we still have fires, as we just saw last week, in which 11 firefighters, were seriously injured and several almost died. So fire is still real, but far less than it was 50 years ago, 100 years ago, when we invented fire departments. So to say we always will need a fire department is different from we'll always need emergency response. There are different kinds of emergencies and different ways of responding to them. So that's the first thing, is I think we need to be focused on the outcome that we're seeking, not the service we're providing. But here we're talking about finance, right? The financial crisis that comes in the wake of the health crisis, and they're intertwined. And then we're talking about community participation, because that's the only way we can cope with the magnitude of the health crisis, the financial crisis, and the crying need in our community that we're going to be facing as we come out of this. And here's why I 100% agree with you, that having those discussions is going to be key, right? This is not a financial problem that can be just solved by somebody writing a check. This is a fundamental reset of expectations on the part of all of us about what we will do with and for each other. And that does come down to the quality of community participation. And it is less about the elected officials or the city manager or the president of the Chamber of Commerce having the answers and just, blowing through. If you just listen to me, this is the right, we got to get the economy back up, says the Chamber of Commerce. We got to preserve services, says the head of the union. We've got to be fair to everybody, says the mayor. All that's well and good, but what we have to have is a conversation in which we find common ground, which is so elusive in today's world. And it requires, again, some humility. And I think that's a lesson that both my faith teaches me and my experience teaches me, including the most recent, which is that there was a cartoon in the New Yorker years ago, father, son, they're in a park, they're looking up at a statue on a pedestal, but instead of a general on a horse with a sword, it's a bunch of people standing there in business suits. And the father says to the son, son, there are no great men anymore, just great committees. And the world of public participation has to change from pro forma public hearings, where you get 2 minutes on Zoom to yell at the council, or even 2 minutes to make a cogent and coherent, rational argument to the council, as best you can do in 2 minutes. It's really about rolling up your sleeves and being being a participant in the process. Democracy isn't just the elected officials doing what the majority of the people say they want in a poll, because that's not real democracy. Real democracy is where people get together and they commonly solve problems, and not just by agreeing on what the government should do, but actually bringing something to the party. An issue like homelessness is you could give the government all the money in the world, and they could build lots of housing, and they could provide lots of services. The LASA just did a report, the LA Homeless Services Authority, on Black people experiencing homelessness, and Black people are disproportionately represented in our homeless population because of reasons of historical racism, but also institutional barriers that Black people face in our society every single day. And it said the number one thing that folks who live with homelessness said about why they were in the situation they were in, leave aside that we don't have enough housing, leave aside institutional racism, leave aside whatever challenges of health or economics. The thing that was hardest for them is not being seen as a human being. as being disregarded, as not having someone who cared about them, a pastor, a friend, a relative, a boss, a neighbor.
Mm.
And so, that's critically important. It might not,
Yeah.
might not sound great in an academic journal, or, in an op-ed piece, or in a 140-word tweet. But it does come down to rolling up your sleeves and being part of the solution.
Yeah.
And a lot of people think that being part of the solution is, well, I sent a tweet, and I was 100% for X or Y or Z, so I've done my job, or I voted for this candidate or that candidate. Government at the local level, you can actually have an impact, whether you serve on a commission, whether you volunteer, or whether you simply talk to one of your council members in the grocery aisle. When you organize your neighbors for a neighborhood watch, when you get together and you tear down the ugly building that needs to be torn down in the park, they're concrete ways. And by the way, they're fulfilling. Right?
Mm-hmm.
They actually, people feel good about it,
Right.
because they've contributed to a solution.
I wonder
Those of us,
yeah.
those of us in local government can't be suspicious of either those conversations or those partnerships. We have to welcome, who was it? Fred Harris used to say, when he lost an election, he said one time, "The people have spoken, the bastards." And it's, we have got to overcome our view that the public are a bunch of toxic maniacs who don't know what they're talking about.
Mm.
The vast majority of people who we don't normally hear from really do want to help.
I want to just a time check. We have about 15 minutes in the session. As I look out over the four horsemen, Rick, the one that seems to be one that has been discussed for years, but now it seems that it is a horseman that has moved to the fore, is the pension debt and obligation issue. And as we know from the 2009-2010 crisis, when a number of California cities declared bankruptcy, albeit for different reasons, but certainly the amount or percentage of the general fund budget that was going out into service pension debt was significant in a couple of those instances. I personally think that we may very well be looking at a number of attempts at municipal bankruptcy in the months ahead.
Yep.
I wonder if you could speak a little bit to that horseman, and what, if any way, do you see forward there, just given the legal implications and the history of courts standing behind pension debt and obligations?
Well, humility again is an issue that I've cared deeply about and worked hard on, and see both the obstacles and the opportunities. Let me talk about the opportunities first. One of the people on the call I noticed is Judy Abdo, who actually chaired a committee that the council gave me the authority to appoint. Normally, the council appoints commissions and committees, but I persuaded them that this was the kind of problem that we couldn't take a political lens to. We had to have diverse opinions, but we needed folks who were not necessarily representative of the political views of the town, but more who were ready to roll up their sleeves and work on the issue. And so, Santa Monica, because it has a much higher per capita number of staff people and has been very generous with pension benefits, even more so than the state as a whole, faced a 450 million, round numbers. It goes up depending upon the economy and actuarial projections, but almost $500 million of unfunded pension obligations, which, to give you an order of magnitude, Santa Monica is incredibly well gifted in assets, 2 billion net assets. That's cash and investments and physical property and real estate that the city owns. But 2 billion in assets, but $500 million in obligations. And so I appointed a committee of 13 folks, and 6 of them were representative of our unions, right? Because they're key stakeholders, and for all the legal reasons you cited, you can't go around them, even if you wanted to, even if that was fair. And 7 citizens, and again, given Santa Monica's diversity, we had some folks who represent the majority at election time, but also some folks who represented the folks who sometimes feel that the council majority doesn't pay attention to them, more fiscally conservative voices. And at the beginning, they were as far apart as A and Z. On the right, let's just get rid of defined benefit pensions and do it like the private sector. And on the left, this is a cyclical crisis. We'll work our way out of it. No need to worry. 2.5 months of really hard work and of listening to each other and working on the issue. We came up with a plan to pay off our entire $450 million pension obligation in 13 years, to accelerate the payment schedule, to make the sacrifices that would require to pay more than we were obligated to do, to take the amortization from 30 years down to 13 years, save the city in the future over $100 million. But it would mean sacrifice now. But we were able to convince people to sacrifice now because times were good. This was last year, right? And so we made our first $9.7 million pension payment over and above the first year of that 13-year paydown schedule. And it meant tightening our belts. It made me unpopular because we had to come up with $9.7 million to give to PERS. But we were taking the long view of this. So I think that we've got to get people around a table and see this as a common threat, not as you people, the public saying, oh, you entitled, overpaid, underworked bureaucrats, you're a threat to us. And the staff realizing, well, yeah, we have this promise, but if there's not enough money in the till, that's not going to work. So it's really, really important that we work together on these things. And I think there's grounds for optimism for doing that, but it's going to take people of goodwill.
Rick, we've got a couple questions here about the use of technology, both in public engagement and other processes. I know that you've been a leader in this space around what's variously called GovTech or Civic Tech. Certainly it's a major part of the coursework and training that we do here at the Graduate Policy School, understanding that the leaders in government, both currently and in the future, are going to have to be much more well-versed in the use of technology to make government more transparent and responsive. Wondering,
just getting Zoom to work is been a
and
challenge.
Here we are. Wondering your thoughts about whether this moment is one of those, to borrow a phrase, crisis we shouldn't let go to waste as it relates to the use of technology.
Yeah, I think that's another important conversation that bears not just on local government, but on our lives, right? I'm not one of those folks who embraces technology uncritically, either in my own life or in the life of my children, or in the life of the government agencies that I've been involved in. But it is far more powerful and less expensive a tool for solving problems than a lot of the tools that have traditionally been in our toolbox. And therefore, we should be careful about what tool we pick up. The old cliche about if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. You can overdo technology, and government is really bad at technology. There's some brilliant people that I've had the privilege of working with and listening to and learning from in the public sector who do technology well. But as a rule, government is way, way behind the private sector in adopting and adapting technology effectively to solve problems. And I think that's the key. is we shouldn't pursue technology for technology's
Mhm.
sake.
Mhm.
What we should think about, are there ways we can utilize technology to solve problems better? The worst thing you can do, and that's why DMV big projects always seem to fail and cost tens of millions of dollars. The worst thing we can do is digitize inefficiency, right? To say, okay,
Mhm.
this is what we've done. We've done it for 100 years,
Mhm.
and now we're going to put it online.
Mhm.
Um, I was on a podcast last week about talking about IT and government, and my interrogator said that one of his clients back east, they mapped out some overlapping social services, and for some of the clients, there were 147 steps to get food stamps and general relief and etc. And 26 of those 147 steps were showing your ID, right? So you had to physically show up somewhere and show them that you had this little card. 26 different times in different contexts and different agencies, and that's absurd. But no one had really paid attention to that. Well, the worst thing to do is put all that online, right? People should be able to do that once,
Mhm.
and it ought to be then available. So technology is a great tool, but it's a tool, and we ought not to have it drive solutions. We ought to have the solutions drive the tools we use.
Rick, we're in our last 5 minutes, and I'm going to try to do something that I know is nearly impossible. I want to go down to the bottom and see if we can't finish on a high note. But I do think that there is something about human nature, and especially these kinds of questions,
Hmm.
that as much as we all know how uniquely desperate these times are, I don't know that we have a full appreciation of what is coming in the months ahead, especially for local government. We hear the governor say a $54 billion
Hmm.
deficit, and we're going to have to find a
Hmm.
way to close it, and maybe the feds can help out.
Hmm.
But missing in that conversation is what's happening at the local level. And you're not a man given to hyperbole, but I wonder, as someone who's been in the midst of these conversations at one of America's great cities, where I happen to call home, if you could give those on the Zoom webinar a sense of where you see things heading for cities fiscally in the months ahead.
Well, no, I don't think hyperbole actually helps us. I think we have to be pretty sober about the realities. The realities are sobering. This is a catastrophic event for communities, and the impacts will be long-lasting and profound. And therefore, again, to emphasize at the beginning, I think we need to take the long view and the high road. Shortcuts will come back to haunt us. Um, it will be important to have real community dialogue and have people participate in solutions and to sign up for the long haul, not figure that, well, I'll weigh in for 5 minutes, tell them what to do, and then check out and go back and try to deal with my private concerns. If you look in the dictionary online or in a book, the definition of idiot, it's a Greek word. And the Greeks used it to describe people who didn't pay attention
Mm-hmm.
to their community life,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because they lived in cities and they lived together, and not unlike the challenges we face today, they didn't have a sophisticated professional government to solve their problems. They had to work together, and they said anybody who wasn't paying attention, anybody who wasn't informed, was an idiot, and they had very little patience for idiots in community life. I think we're going to have to get past the idiot stage of reacting to this, see it as a long-term, complicated, collaborative, adaptive challenge. And serious people have to show up with serious commitment, not to imposing their answers, but to listening and to working and to finding common ground. I think there are serious people like that. I think America is always at its best. Churchill said, Americans can always be counted on
Right.
to solve their problems after they've exhausted every other alternative. Right? We like to postpone things. We like to blame people. We like to wait for the crisis. But then Americans are remarkably resilient and remarkably generous
Mm.
in what they bring once they realize that they've got to show up. And you see that in our healthcare system. We have a terrible healthcare system that costs twice as much as any other country. Although in many ways it performs extremely well at the extremes, but the bread and butter doesn't work very well at all. But look at what the people in that system have been able to do, are doing every day.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I would never bet against America and Americans. And I think the forum for that is going to be at the local level, because none of us really can. I mean, we can vote about what happens in November in Washington, but where we can truly make a difference, whether as staff people, whether as elected people, whether as citizens, and I don't mean that in an invidious sense of the political, but citizens of a city, people who live in a community regardless of their legal status. The citizens of our communities need to step up, and I believe they will.
Well, Rick, that's a great closing, and you actually did accomplish my feat that I thought was impossible, to bring us down and then take us back up. It is, I do think that part of the reason behind the Churchill quote was sometimes we're so grateful for the things that we have. There's sometimes we don't acknowledge when things have gone completely off kilter. And I think that we could foresee an awakening of civic engagement and participation earlier if we got a clearer sense of really how difficult the months ahead are going to be. And that's not being a doomsayer. I think that's just being rational about the indicators that we're seeing all around us. And
I would charge everyone on this call to contribute to that and to be part of that. Many of the people already are.
Yep.
And particularly, I think there's a key role for the academic sector here to come down from the ivory tower.
Yep.
And be a catalytic voice of bringing expertise and knowledge and research and analytics, but be part of the solution.
Well, thanks so much, Rick. And certainly I count the School of Public Policy here, not only in convening this conversation, but through our alums. We're working all over the state and world, and the continued efforts here to engage with our local communities as being a central purpose of our mission here at the Policy School. That brings us to a close for this webinar, the latest in our Politics and Pandemic series. Rick, thank you so much for that.
Thank you, Pete.
A heads up, next week will be our next webinar. Next Tuesday at 10 a.m., we're going to be looking at the impact of the pandemic on our K-12 education system, and we'll be welcoming national experts on education policy for a discussion I know you won't want to miss. All of you who have registered for this webinar will be receiving a link to the recorded version of this webinar, and will also get a link if you'd like to register for next week. These webinars are made possible due to the gracious support of donors and supporters here to the School of Public Policy. I have listed Matt Cutler's email address in the chat box, matt.cutler@pepperdine.edu. He heads up our advancement and fundraising efforts here. And if you'd like to be a part of supporting the ongoing work here of this unique graduate school as we continue to convene important conversations like this one and prepare that next generation of leaders who are going to be leading in a post-pandemic world, please reach out to Matt. So that'll bring us to a close again for this webinar. Thank you all for not only your engagement, but your interest in this vital subject matter. Please know that the Policy School will continue to engage on these issues in the weeks, months, and years ahead. as we say at Pepperdine, God bless you all, and look forward to seeing you back online and hopefully in person soon. Stay safe.